This lecture is entitled Potsdam, Marriage on the Skids. In other words, our subject matter is to look at the Potsdam Conference in June 1945, few weeks after Germany's unconditional surrender. The Big Three are reassembling again to essentially carve up a grand settlement in Berlin, the enemy capital, and to revisit the unfinished business of Yalta. And as you can see from the title Marriage on the Skids, the Potsdam Agreement, which does come to fruition, is in essence an agreement to continue to not agree. And as a result, there is no grand settlement, and essentially the marriage between Stalin and the West is on borrowed time. Now, to start this lecture, we need to put put ourselves in the context of what went on before. Particularly in June 1945, just a few days before the conference's formal inauguration, the U.S. Congress brought to an end the Lend-Lease system that was providing the Soviet Union with significant amounts of aid, whether it was in the form of natural resources, industrial goods, rubber, trucks. This came to an end. Now, if you look at the actual law as it passed in Congress, it was slated to end because it was by nature an extraordinary measure that would come to an end once the hostilities had ended, which they did in May 1945. However, from the Soviet perspective, the ending of the Lend-Lease system, which had been a vital lifeline to the Red Army during World War II, was sending a diplomatic signal that the Americans were going to drive a hard message at Potsdam. With the war over, they no longer had any need for the Soviet alliance. And as Stalin had always suspected, the West would reshift to its anti-communist position. Now, another thing that dramatically changed was the cast. Because during World War II, the Big Three had consisted of FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. And they had led their respective states through the various vagaries of war. And in particular, FDR had played a very vital role as diplomat. That was probably or arguably his greatest skill. In fact, at the Tehran conference, one of the things that FDR had made a point of doing was poking fun at Churchill in front of Stalin, which immediately created a little bit of a bond between FDR and Stalin. And it was sending, of course, an important signal that despite the special relationship between Britain and the United States, in fact, a relationship that was unprecedented in the way that they had integrated their armed forces, that nonetheless the United States accepted Stalin as a real partner. With FDR gone, not only was this important glue to the Big Three missing, but now he was replaced by Harry Truman, the plain-spoken Missourian, who had some very unpolitical comments during Hitler's invasion of Russia. So from the perspective of Stalin, who had no relationship to Truman, the removal of FDR the replacement of New Deal socialists with Harry Truman's brand of evangelical anti-communism was a matter of concern. And just 1 week into the conference, Churchill as well had to bid adieu because he had lost an election, a landslide to the Labour Party. He was replaced by Clement Attlee. And although Clement Attlee was a socialist, he was not a person that had any great rapport with Stalin. Now, across in the bargaining table were essentially two strangers, including an American president who had drawn a very hard line with Foreign Secretary Molotov before the Potsdam meeting. So it was very clear to Stalin that at Potsdam he was dealing with a difficult situation. He tried to drive a hard bargain in terms of achieving, particularly now, reparations to rebuild the Soviet Union. For about a week, he brought back the Yalta Agreement, which had been tabled, and the idea of $8 million in reparations for the Soviet Union. And then the Potsdam Conference kind of reached its climax because in the midst of the conference, an aide went to Henry Truman's ear and whispered that Trinity was a success. In other words, the United States had developed a nuclear bomb. Now, the American calculations, which had prevailed at Yalta, shifted. They no longer believed that they needed the Red Army to defeat Japan. In fact, they saw Soviet interference in Asia now as problematic as the Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe made it seem that they would be difficult to reach a deal with them, and they were trying to expand Soviet influence across the world. On the other hand, although the United States did not feel like it needed the Soviet Union anymore, it could not get anything from them, the United States had to acknowledge, as it was withdrawing its troops from Europe, that the Red Army had its troops all throughout Eastern Europe. The Red Army could not be dislodged. So no matter what the United States may want relative to Poland and the future of Eastern Europe, the fact of the matter is that Stalin controlled their destiny. So what we can see is that the Potsdam Conference, which had as its unofficial mission to create a grand settlement, to deal the unresolved issues of Yalta, there was really very little chance that it could ever do that. What made matters worse is that the sides mistrusted each other. Particularly the antipathy between Truman and Stalin was very high. At one point in his diary, Stalin noted that Truman is worthless, expressing essentially his frustration that Truman was not willing to provide American assistance to rebuild the Soviet Union that had done the heavy lifting for the war and that had played the major role in defeating Nazi Germany. In essence, though, the Potsdam Agreement was dead on arrival because all of the major parties had already achieved their principal war aims. In particular, Nazi Germany was defeated. The West, the United States had liberated Western Europe. The Soviet Union had a buffer zone now in Eastern Europe. And, essentially what they wanted, the Soviet Union wanted, American money. The United States and Britain wanted free elections in Eastern Europe. That was kind of gravy that they would like to achieve. But the only way to achieve it is if the other party consented to it, and the other party wasn't willing to. So in essence, the Potsdam Agreement was at an impasse, and there was no way or formula for removing the logjam. Now, if we look at the Potsdam Agreement itself, what we can see that was really disputed over these 2.5 weeks was the reparations formula. $20 billion had been, kind of outlined as a figure by Stalin. The United States and Britain had come to the calculation that Germany was perhaps worth $8 billion, so that this figure was outlandish and fantastical, an invention of Soviet negotiators for leverage to get deal or money loans from the United States. Another thing, though, wasn't just the reparations issue, it was also kind of a philosophical issue. From the West, there was this sense that they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of Versailles, that you would so punish your enemy that, in a way, by driving a hard bargain, you would defeat yourself by creating so much animosity in your defeated enemy that they wouldn't accept the deal. So what you wanted to do is to come up with a formula that punished Germany, but also rehabilitated them so that they would become partners for the peace. Now, from the Soviet perspective, this whole philosophy was alien, novel, and flagrantly selfish. Because the way that World War II had played out, most of the devastation was in Eastern Europe. The United States had suffered almost no war damage. So a magnanimous peace might be something that was morally laudable, but this was overlooking the fact that the Soviet Union was devastated, and that the Soviet Union, or that Hitler had launched a Vernichtungskrieg on Soviet territory, butchering civilians, starving to death Russian POWs. How could you be magnanimous against such an evil empire? So there was a lot of bickering where the West was trying to insist on the Atlantic Charter and free elections in Eastern Europe, and Stalin was demanding monetary representations. Essentially went on for about a week, each side presenting proposals, not reaching agreement. And then there was, essentially the Truman moment where he stared down Stalin and said, I've been listening to you asking for compensation. I want to remind you the United States is not getting anything out of this deal. We're not accepting any territory. And we gave you territory. At Tehran, we agreed to move Poland to the west. So you already have your compensation. Now, if you want to negotiate a loan or some deal from the United States, we're prepared to enter into an agreement to that effect. We'll negotiate with you. But then you have to give up your territorial compensation. And essentially, when it was pushed to that point, Stalin realized that it was a dead letter, essentially forced into a binary choice, territory or perhaps a future economic deal. He took the bird in his hand rather than two birds in the future. And in this sense, Potsdam was a failure. It was a failure because they weren't able to essentially bridge the differences that had appeared at Yalta. And Stalin felt that he had been betrayed and cheated, that the Soviet Union didn't get what they deserved. And as a result, even though he agrees to a very skinny Potsdam deal, he's continually trying to revise it through various pressure tactics in Germany, Iran, and Turkey. So it essentially poisons the post-war relationship and sets the stage for the later divorce. So in this sense, the Potsdam Agreement, and they do come up with an agreement. You can read the document and see the terms of it. But what is, despite all the things that they agree on, what's really striking is that they don't really agree on the big questions, at least for the most part, particularly the German question. How is Germany going to be, at one hand weakened, but also reintegrated into the European strategic framework? This was a very big question. Probably all of the parties had arrived at Potsdam with the idea that Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, and probably deindustrialized. But at the end of the conference, they hadn't reached an agreement on that formula. So in other words, a grand settlement, a final peace, was not agreed upon, and they had to create this extraordinary mechanism, the Council of Foreign Ministers, that would continue to meet as representatives of the big three to hammer out this deal. But in essence, because they weren't able to agree to a final settlement, they were all still occupying Germany. And with time, the Yalta map, which was just supposed to be provisional and skeletal, really a bare bones agreement, essentially became the building block for post-war Europe. And as time went on, the inability to agree at Potsdam, there was no way to really reconcile these differences. So both sides were trying to come up with a grand settlement without willing to concede to the other what they wanted. It created a situation of mutual animosity that poisoned post-war diplomacy. And we'll look at that that cycle in the next module. But essentially, the Berlin crisis marks the final divorce settlement. And in this divorce settlement, since there was no substantial progress at Potsdam, the Yalta Agreement, by default, became the bedrock or blueprint for post-war Europe. Now, if you look at it on the more positive side, from 45 to 48, as acrimonious as Stalin's relationship was with the West, they did remain partners. In other words, at a basic level, they accepted the broad parameters of the deals that they negotiated while they were allies. The alliance didn't formally end, even if they were working within the structures of their alliance for to get what they wanted. Now, as a result of that, the Atlantic Order was able to come in. Essentially, the United Nations was established in San Francisco in 1945, and the Soviet Union became a member with a veto arrangement. But Stalin set out a lot of other international bodies, like the Bretton Woods system. Both sides accepted the Yalta boundaries. They pulled their troops back to the Yalta lines. They jointly occupied Germany. On the other hand, the ACC became essentially a mechanism or a conduit for tension, because since they weren't getting along, they used all mechanisms where they were together to try to push their rival for their own advantage. So one example of this is that the ACC quickly breaks down because the Soviet Union refuses to transport coal and wheat and food to the western urban areas of Germany. Now, the Soviet Union participates in Nuremberg. There's a few embarrassing moments when essentially the Nazis bring up the Katyn Forest massacre. The Soviet Union, however, does not block the Declaration of Human Rights, but they don't sign it either. They essentially just abstain from it. So, enough of the cooperation emerged that this new international system was established, and this was probably a good thing. On the other hand, this new order was flawed. It had been predicated on the idea of continued Soviet-U.S. cooperation, and instead the two leading superpowers were at odds ends and bickering for mutual supremacy. So looking at the Grand Alliance from roughly 1941 to 1949, when it was essentially formally dissolved, looking at these twists and turns, the moments of maximum understanding, the Moscow Declaration in 1943, the low point maybe Yalta or maybe Potsdam when Truman called out Stalin. What is your read on this? Was there any way for the Grand Alliance to survive the achievement of it's essentially the goal of the alliance, the destruction of Hitler's Germany? Was there any way that the Soviet Union and the United States could have, despite their differences, reached an accommodation, a basic agreement, a grand settlement? Or was essentially the differences between Stalin and the West so fundamental, their interests so incompatible that essentially some type of divorce, a reset to a more normal rivalry was all but baked into the cake?